We're going to move from simplifying quadratics to solving quadratics. The first way we're going to be solving quadratics is through square roots. And what a square root is it's an opposite operation from a squared. So if we look at our first example, we see an x squared plus 5 equals negative 11. So our first step is we subtract the 5 on both sides. That gives us x squared is equal to negative 16. Then the opposite of squaring something is taking a square root. So we take a square root. And when we do that, we know that negative 16 is negative 1 and 16. Square root of 16 is 4. Square root of negative 1 is I. So our answer is x equals 4i. Now, because we created the square root, we're not sure if it's a positive root or if it's a negative root. Just as an example, if we were to have 5 squared, that would be 25. And if we were to have negative 5 squared, that would also be 25. So we're not sure if inside the x is a positive root or a negative root when we substitute. So what we're going to do is we're going to put both answers. And so that's why we get x equals plus or minus 4i. Now for the second one, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to add the 3 first. That gives us 2x squared is equal to negative 100. We divide by 2, and that gives us x squared is equal to negative 50. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take the square root, and once again, the reason that we're taking the square root is because the opposite operation of squaring is a square root. So we're able to get the x by itself. Now, whenever we do that, we have to remember the plus or minus because we're not sure if it's a positive root or a negative root. We know that 50 is 25, negative 1, and 2. Square root of 25 is 5. Square root of negative 1 is I. And so we have plus or minus 5i square root of 2. Letter C. First step is subtract the 8. And that gives us 3x squared equals negative 7. We're going to divide it by the 3. When we divide it by the 3, we get x squared is equal to negative 7 over 3. Then the opposite of squaring something is taking a square root. Now this one causes a little bit of a problem because we have a denominator inside the square root, so we're going to rationalize it. And whenever we create a square root, remember we have a plus or minus answer. The negative means that there's an I. 7 times 3 is 21. 3 times 3 is 9, and the square root of 9 is 3. So that right there gives us our answer. Now we're going to look at problems that have parentheses. Our process is going to be the same. Where students make a mistake is they want to FOIL this because they see the squared, but we're not going to do that. We're going to get rid of the square using a square root, just like what we did on the previous 3. So our first step is going to be adding the 1. And that gives us x plus 2 squared is equal to 16. Then we take the square root. And when we take the square root, what we have to remember is that there are 2 answers, a positive and a negative. Then when we subtract the 2, we have to remember that since there's 2 answers, we have to take the positive 4 minus 2, which is 2. And then we take the negative 4 minus 2 is negative 6. For letter E, first step is subtracting the 9. And so we have 2x minus 3 squared equals negative 16. We divide it by 2. And so that gives us x minus 3 squared is equal to negative 8. What we're going to do is we're going to get rid of the square by taking the square root. Negative 8 is negative 1, 4, and 2. And so we know the square root of negative 1 is I, square root of 4 is 2. So since we created our own square root, we have the plus or minus, we have the 2i, and we have the square root of 2. Our last step is to add the 3. 3 is a real number. 2i is an imaginary number. So that means that we can't combine them. Our final answer is x equals 3 plus or minus 2i square root of 2. For letter F, first thing that we're going to do is subtract the 20. And that gives us 3x plus 5 squared equals negative 17. We divide it by 3. We're seeing that we have a denominator. So we have x plus 5 squared is equal to negative 17 over 3. Once again, what we're going to do is create a square root in order to get rid of the squared. And that gives us x plus 5 equals. We have to rationalize this because once we put a square root, we can't have a square root in the denominator. And so that gives us the square root of negative is an I. 3 times 17 gives us 51. 3 times 3 is 9. Square root of 9 is 3. And our last step is we subtract the 5. And so what we get is x equals negative 5 plus or minus I square root of 51 over 3. Pause the video and try those next 3 on your own and see how you do. For letter G, we're going to add the 8. And x squared is equal to negative 52. The opposite of squaring something is taking a square root. So that gives us x equals plus or minus, and then 52 is negative 1, 4, and 13. Square root of 4 is 2. Square root of negative 1 is I. So we have plus or minus 2i square root of 13. Letter H. First thing that we're going to do is subtract the 20. And we have 7x squared equals negative 11. We're going to divide it by 7. So x squared is equal to negative 11 over 7. Then what we do is we take the square root. When we take the square root, we know that the negative gives us an I. We have to rationalize it because we can't have a square root in the denominator. So x equals plus or minus I square root of 77 over 7. Now our last one. First thing that we're going to do is subtract the 8. That gives us 2x plus 3 squared equals negative 14. We divide it by 2. And so x plus 3 squared equals negative 7. I take the square root in order to get rid of the squared. So x plus 3 equals, remember the plus or minus. The negative tells us it's an I, and there is no simplifying 7, so we leave it as the square root of 7. And our last step is we're going to subtract the 3. 3 is a real number, and the I squared of 7 is an imaginary number, so we cannot combine them. So we have x equals negative 3 plus or minus I square root of 7.